A historic turning point was taking place and sanctions were supposed to be lifted. Well, a year on, most sanctions are basically still in place and Western anti-Iran rhetoric has not lessened. The latest war on words was initiated by German Chancellor Angela Merkel and UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, questioning Iran's right to its missile program. Stay with us as we take a look at the latest between the JCPOA countries who signed that agreement and the Islamic Republic of Iran.
It's only days until the first anniversary of a nuclear deal signed between Iran and the 5 permanent members of the United Nations Security Council plus Germany in Vienna. The deal that came after months of arduous negotiations promised to lift all nuclear-related sanctions imposed on Iran by the European Union, the Security Council and the US. Tehran in return put some limitations on its nuclear activities. The deal was described by some observers as a new era in relations between Iran and the West. But as it went on, it turned out that the West is not determined enough to keep its promises. In the latest development, the United Nations Secretary General pointed to Iran's missile launches, saying the program is not in the spirit of a nuclear deal. His comments echoed those of German Chancellor Angela Merkel, who on Thursday criticized Tehran for its ballistic missile tests that, as she put it, are inconsistent with the nuclear deal. Iran has said in reaction that it will press ahead with its ballistic missile program, citing defense doctrines and national security considerations as the reason. Foreign Ministry spokesman Bahram Qasemi says Iran's missile program is not linked to the nuclear deal and does not conflict with the UN Security Council resolution endorsing the agreement.
Well, the nuclear deal had nothing to do with Iran being able to defend itself, including its missile defense program, which is entirely for defense, easily provable because Iran has never used missiles offensively.
Critics of Iran's missile program claim the projectiles are capable of carrying nuclear warheads. This is while Iran has repeatedly said its missile plan is entirely peaceful in nature and is not intended at violating the nuclear deal. In nearly 1 year since the nuclear deal was signed, Western officials have on many occasions confirmed that Iran has complied with its obligations and refrained from doing anything in violation of the deal. Just recently, U.S. State Department spokesman John Kirby said there's no evidence to prove that Tehran has breached the nuclear agreement. Western countries, however, keep repeating their same old scenario against Iran, a stance that prompted head of Iran's Atomic Energy Organization Ali Akbar Salehi to say the comments made against Tehran's missile program could be a clue to an incipient conspiracy against the country.
So they're trying to guilt-trip Iran into saying, unless you throw down every defensive weapon, you're not being constructive.
Tehran has accused Western countries, especially the US, of trying to indirectly dodge responsibility under the nuclear accord. The fact that many large European banks still refrain from engaging in transactions with Iran for fear of US penalties, and the US Congress attempts to pass new anti-Iran legislatures are indicative of the lack of determination on the part of Western countries regarding Iran. The nuclear deal has put to test the reliability and sincerity of Western countries. So far, they have left a record that suggests the West's lack of determination and sabotaging efforts may be a prelude to further negligence toward the historic deal with Iran.
I'd like to welcome my guest to the program from the Answer Coalition, Mr. Brian Becker out of Washington, D.C. Well, Mr. Becker, looking at the situation, Chancellor Angela Merkel told Parliament in Berlin on Thursday that missile launches by Iran earlier this year were inconsistent with the UN resolution. However, Iran has continuously denied this. How do you see this?
Well, Iran has complied with the resolution, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action that allowed very stringent intrusive inspections to take place in Iran, determining and validating the fact that the country will not and does not have a nuclear weapons capability. Iran has complied with its side of the agreement. Iran never agreed to unilaterally disarm itself and do away with all of modern weaponry. Obviously, they live in a part of the world where there's a lot of dangers. The United States has invaded Iraq. NATO countries bombed Libya and destroyed the government there. Foreign governments, both in the West and their proxies, have done a great deal to fragment Syria. Of course, there's Saudi Arabia, which constitutes an endless confrontation with Iran. And of course, Israel, which has nuclear weapons, perhaps several hundred of them, and has determined that Iran is a mortal enemy, an existential enemy. And while Iran has gone along with the NPT, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and now the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, making it very clear that it does not and will not acquire nuclear weapons, Israel avoids all NPT inspections, does have nuclear weapons, and under those circumstances, why would Iran get rid of its ballistic missile capability? Iran did not agree to that. That's not part of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action.
Okay, we're waiting for our next guest to join us, but in the meantime, staying with you. Mr. Becker, have we entered the phase that the leader of the Islamic Revolution said would happen, and that is if an agreement is reached for the nuclear program, then these countries led by Washington would then point their finger at Iran's missile program, then it would be human rights violation, then that would always be an excuse to control Iran. This is a comment that he made before the signing of the JCPOA. How do you see it?
Well, it certainly seems to be the case. I mean, in a way, there's nothing Iran can do that allows the United States and Western powers, who were the colonizing powers in Africa and in the Middle East, to say, let's have a live and let live relationship. Let's allow Iran, a country that's become genuinely, authentically independent since the 1979 revolution, which overthrew a government, the Shah, which had been imposed on the Iranian people through a U.S.-British coup d'etat in 1953, and then remained on the throne, ruling the country at the behest of his patrons for 26 years. It appears that the United States and the Western powers just don't want Iran to be genuinely independent and sovereign.
Let me just stop you right there, Brian. Let me just stop you right there, Brian Becker, with what you said. That is that the bottom line of it all, that basically the United States still has a problem with the Islamic Republic of Iran that has taken over since the 1979 revolution. Is it an argument basically based on Iranian sovereignty that Washington cannot accept?
Well, sovereignty meaning a government that's genuinely independent. Iran is big enough, its people are educated enough, it has enough oil, it has enough water, it's got all that which it needs to have in order to be a regional power. And the U.S. obviously wants hegemonic control over this resource-rich part of the world. That accounts for the genuine, the ongoing, enduring confrontation from the United States. The Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action did represent a shift in U.S. policy. It represented, at least within the Obama administration, that wing of the U.S. government that doesn't want to have an escalating confrontation with the Iranian government. But that doesn't mean that there's not enough of a lobby in Washington that's hostile to Iran that won't continue to chip away and try to break apart any sort of live and let live détente or rapprochement between the U.S., the West, and Iran.
So you see two poles, Brian?
You're
saying that there are two different poles within the government. Is that why we're seeing this contradictory behavior coming out of Washington?
There are two different poles, both of whom are hostile to Iran, both of whom have sort of organic foundational opposition or hostility to Iran. But there's one wing which represents the hawk, the militarist wing, that actually wants to take the confrontation with Iran to the point of escalating military tension. The military-industrial complex benefits from that. They're incentivized because they make a lot of money when there's tension. And also Israel and those who are the fondest of Israel's designs in the Middle East are also always constantly egging the situation to break apart any possible even thaw or diminution of tension between Washington and Tehran. So there's two wings. There's definitely a debate. But both wings are hostile to Iran. It's just that one has accepted the reality that Iranian regime change is not about to happen, and so they've come to this agreement called the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action.
Being that, if that is the case, what you have just described, and you were an Iranian official, can there be any hope, basically, of agreements being fulfilled? Even this JCPOA, at the end of the day, it would appear, based on that premise that you have just mentioned, that though the agreement has been signed, that Washington will do its best not to fulfill its side of the bargain.
Yes, but I think there has been a palpable lifting or easing of sanctions so that Iran is the beneficiary of the agreement through the Joint Comprehensive Plan. So just to be very clear, it doesn't mean that Iran has not gained anything from the Joint Comprehensive Plan. I believe it has. That's my own opinion. And of course, if if Iran had forsworn nuclear weapons anyway, the fact that there's been a lessening or an easing of sanctions is beneficial to Iran. But what I'm also saying is that if there was a vulnerability, let's say a division within Iran, let's say what happened with the Green Movement in 2009, where there appeared to be the possibility, because of divisions within Iranian society, that the Iranian government itself could be toppled, the United States, both wings of this debate, I'm saying, in Washington, would lock into and support those who could possibly overthrow the government. So there's an ongoing sort of debate within Washington, but I think the Obama administration no longer believes that regime change is feasible or valid. It's not going to happen in Iran. The Iranian government appears to be very, very stable.
Well, looking at that side of things, do you think that perhaps the United States has actually, by its what many would term as aggressive acts, even after the signing of the JCPOA, actually discredit themselves? You pointed out to the 2009 post-election situation here in Iran. And of course, there were individuals that felt that having relations, even direct relations with the U.S. would be the way to go and everything would be solved. And of course, the other side of the spectrum was the opposite. And now that this agreement was signed, of course, not just with the United States, but with several other countries, do you think that in many ways that Iran has signed, that Iran is keeping its side of the bargain, but that the other side has not, actually ends up discrediting itself, perhaps inside of Iran? How do you see that?
I think it definitely does. I mean, the Iranian people, who are very alert and educated and much more aware of the international politics, say, than the American people, sadly, they'll be well aware if the United States is not operating in good faith. They'll be very aware if the Western powers are not operating in good faith. People will certainly have a dim view of the United States if it doesn't live up to its side of the bargain.
Okay, stay with me, Brian. Sorry to interrupt you, but so sorry, but we've actually fortunately been able to get that connection going, and apologies to our viewers from Boston, Mr. Jim Walsh, Security Studies Program from MIT. Sorry about that technical difficulties. Thanks so much for being with us. How do you see it, Jim Walsh? I'm not sure if you had the audio, at least, to the first part.
I did.
Okay, great. Okay, great. Your comments then, sir. We'll just go from there. I'm looking at the United States. Is it that, as we were talking, is it that the bottom line is that Washington cannot deal with a sovereign Islamic Republic, or what is behind these continual accusations in your perspective?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of confusion as I've listened to these many minutes. Your program began talking about Ban Ki-moon. He's at the UN, and then it shifted to Germany and Angela Merkel. Your own broadcast, your own report leading in, quoted a U.S. official saying Iran is complying with the agreement. So I don't quite understand how we start with Ban Ki-moon and the German Chancellor, and suddenly the next 80% of it is Washington, 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 when your own report says that Washington says Iran is abiding by the agreement.
And perhaps you
Now,
didn't hear, let me just
the
jump in then, sir. Perhaps you didn't hear that many actually of our experts have pointed out that Germany in itself and also the UN is taking its lead from Washington. But go ahead with the other.
Well, what evidence do you have for that? What evidence do you have for that? I mean, you actually had the audio and visual of an American official saying Iran is abiding by the agreement. I don't know what more you want than that. Now, let's back up and talk about the two different issues in substance. They're two different issues. One is missiles, one is nuclear. You know, my own view, the language in the UN resolution calls upon Iran not to carry out missile tests related to nuclear development. But that's not mandatory language. Calls upon doesn't mean it's a requirement of the agreement. So I'm certainly not surprised that Iran is moving forward with its missile program. You know, if it was up to me, if I had negotiated the agreement, I would not have mixed missiles and nuclear together. But that's what's happened. But I don't expect the status quo to change here. I expect that Iran will continue to work on its missile program, and since that's not prohibited in the UN resolution, then we can continue to talk about it, but it doesn't really matter.
Well, let's look at
the
that.
other issue,
let's
though,
look
is
at just what
something-
you've said, Mr. Walsh, because we know as far as the U.S. Congress and actually being quite aggressive in trying, we have seen establishment of more sanctions. We have seen actually debate in trying to get...
No, we haven't.
We have not since the agreement JCPOA was signed, sir. Since the JCPOA was signed,
Right.
there was additional sanctions actually put on Iran by the United States. My point in this, sir, is do you think that there is this innate aggression by the U.S. and other Western entities against Iran? Or what's the bottom line to this, whether we're talking about Ban Ki-moon, or we're talking about Angela Merkel, or we're talking about Washington?
Yeah, I think you're mixing apples and oranges. Now, in the U.S., it's certainly true that there's a group in Congress who have actively tried to pass new sanctions. They have not been able to do that. There have been no new sanctions imposed on Iran since the JCPOA. There have been, as you know, the agreement leaves alone U.S. national sanctions, and under that architecture, there have been more people designated. But there's been no new legislation passed enforcing new sanctions. Congress has not been able to pass that. The president opposes it, and in the U.S. system, the executive branch handles foreign policy. So, of course there are going to be political disagreements, and we're going to continue to have that, as we've seen in the campaign. But, Congress is not the president. It's the president that runs foreign policy, and we, at the top of the program, you said there haven't been any sanctions relief. I agree with my colleague. There has been sanctions relief.
No, I did not, sir. I said little.
On oil sales,
I said
in
little.
other areas.
Yeah, the comment was actually little
I
sanction
think the
relief.
oil sales is worth billions of dollars.
Well,
billions
it's
and billions
Iran's
of dollars.
right, isn't it,
now,
sir?
we still have
Okay. All right, let me
Pardon
get
me?
Mr. Becker in on this. Mr. Becker, how do you see this? Because actually, as a matter of fact, what we have seen, as Mr. Walsh rightly said, it was more individuals actually being sanctioned right after the signing of this, seeming to actually have an effect on the whole spirit of the agreement. What we also have seen was a continuing flexing of the muscle by Washington on international companies, especially European companies, who have complained to the Iranians themselves that it's because of possible ramifications by the United States that they don't make the move. And many would say that German Chancellor Merkel is taking her lead from the United States. How do you see it, sir?
Well, both things are actually true. I mean, the Republicans in Congress keep introducing sanctions resolutions that are designed to torpedo the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, but President Obama makes it clear that he will veto those. And as a consequence of the way the votes shake out in Washington, the Republicans who actually want to torpedo it right now, the Joint Comprehensive Plan, don't have the votes to do it. That doesn't mean that there aren't other pressures that are being applied on Iran. If we're talking about the spirit rather than the letter of the Joint Comprehensive Plan, I agree with you completely that the pressure that's still being applied on European financial institutions to inhibit or obstruct or create fear about transactions with Iran are not in the spirit of the Joint Comprehensive Plan. There has been significant sanctions relief. Of course, not fully, and as the other guest said, the U.S. government maintains its own American sanctions on Iran. So here, where are we? Like if we step back and look at the big picture, at this moment, at the moment that we're talking, there is a meeting going on in Warsaw, Poland, which is the summit of NATO, 28 countries plus 26 partners. It's a big deal. And the U.S. government is still insisting on the creation of a missile defense shield in Poland, for instance. And the Americans keep saying it's because to defend Europe from Iranian ballistic missiles. Russia says at the same time, well, that's not true. The Joint Comprehensive Plan makes it clear that Iran will not have a nuclear weapons delivered through a ballistic missile system, and it's just a pretext. So I think there's an intertanglement right now of different agendas that are going on. I agree with you that the spirit of the Joint Comprehensive Plan means that the American government and both in Congress and the executive branch should be lifting sanctions rather than intensifying pressure on Iran.
And Jim Walsh, what do you think is the biggest impediment to actually Iran getting totally back, if you want to say, in the global community and being able to operate business as usual like other sovereign countries?
Yeah, I think there are two things there. One of them is this, we have to overcome the fear that private investors and banks have in doing business with Iran. John Kerry, Secretary of State, has tried to address that. But remember, these are private actors. You know, if you go and you want to dismantle a centrifuge, the government goes and does that. But the government cannot force private individuals to invest or do banking. Now, we've had the Boeing deal, right? That's an American firm selling lots of planes to Iran. We've had progress on oil, but the bankers tend to be the most conservative. So that is going to be a tough nut to crack, and they're just going to have to work on it. But Iran also has to get its own house in order. It has to be a place that is attractive to investment, and that means reforming the central bank and doing other sorts of things that introduce transparency so that investors feel that that's a good risk for them to invest. So Iran has to get its own act together, but we continue to have to work this banking thing, and there is progress there. It's just very frustratingly slow.
Okay, and Brian Becker, your take, same question. 1 minute, sir.
Okay, I think what's needed right now is for the United States government and the Western powers, who themselves have an affirmative obligation under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, to which they are all signatories because they are nuclear powers. They have an affirmative obligation to begin their own disarmament or the gradual elimination of nuclear weapons. That they are not doing. If we want to talk about the spirit of nuclear non-proliferation, which was the way the Joint Comprehensive Plan was framed, it's incumbent on Germany, on France, on the UK, on the United States to do that which they're not doing right now, which is instead of bringing in a new generation of nuclear weapons, really genuinely, authentically, earnestly, sincerely getting rid of those nuclear weapons. That's the spirit of nuclear non-proliferation, and it's the law,
I
the NPT.
appreciate both of you being with us. We're right out of time. From the Answer Coalition, Mr. Brian Becker out of Washington, D.C. Security Studies Program, MIT, Mr. Jim Walsh out of Boston. And as always, viewers, we appreciate you being with us on another debate right here at Press TV. I'm Marzia Hashemi signing out for myself and all the crew. Thanks so much. See you next time.